All right, so yeah. Again. Yeah, if you don't mind. Sorry.
Oh,
Wonderful.
excellent. So we're super pleased this morning to welcome Dr. Lisa Lim, who is an associate professor with research interests in multilingualism, language contact, and world and Asian Englishes. So please join me for a very warm round of applause in welcoming her this morning.
Thank you very much. Let me get right to it. Greetings, everyone at the IEL, to all my IEL Summer School participants, whether you're there in Newcastle in person or in some other place and time zone. Just as I'm here joining you from Perth, Western Australia, where it's actually sundowner time now. I want, first of all, to acknowledge the Wajik Nyunga people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work and from which I'm speaking to you now. Very quick thanks to start off to Professor Karen Corrigan and team for the invitation to contribute a lecture to this year's IELTS Summer School. I have incredibly fond memories actually of previous ones. In 2013 in Freiburg, the first of IELTS postdoctoral spring schools where I was the speaker and teaching faculty, and in 2019 again in Regensburg, and I only wish I could be there again in person. But thanks to technology, we can still do this even while I'm over here. So let me quickly share my screen. Which I believe you can see. I saw a chat. Yeah, sorry, is that a thumbs up? Sorry, no, you're all tiny now. Yeah, good, thank you. I see a chat coming in as well, so I can't see the chats. Okay, sorry, I've just seen the chats. Yes, about timing. All right, all good. All right, so let me get that going. My abstract promised 3 areas of rethinking to illustrate the significance of the contact dynamics in the evolution of Englishes in the multilingual ecologies of Asia for the theorization and decolonization of the linguistics of English. But we don't have very much time. So I'm afraid in my talk, I think I'm only going to be able to focus on just 2 of these. Apologies to if you were looking forward to one of those. And if there's time, perhaps we can take that up in the Q&A. So let's get cracking. Let's start with rethinking histories. And as scholars of English linguistics and or of world Englishes, you will surely be familiar with the usual account of the historical spread of the English language via the first and second diasporas in the establishment of settlement, trade, exploitation, colonies. This is a story that is really well recounted, well documented. But in our aim to rethink histories when we're thinking about contact and Englishes, I've been doing this for a while now, right? I've been really intrigued about going beyond the usual account of contact between the English speaking, settlers, traders, etc., and the indigenous language populations during that era of empires, the conventional ones, but instead, pay attention to other ecologies and other players, right? Other populations and languages across the networks. And because I'm interested in our work in Asia, then the networks of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Other contact circumstances which are equally as critical in the formation of Englishes in the region. Directly or indirectly. And in our exploration today, and some of the things that I've recently been working on, I look at these things by charting the roots of the transmission of cultural words, which have assumed some kind of prominent position in Asian imaginaries and languages. Okay, so words, just like material artifacts, can provide insights into population movements, so too can intangible one, right, such as words. This is also very constructive from a methodological level, right? Because the close study of lexical transmission also offers us a way of reconstructing various kinds of sociolinguistic trajectories. So we start off looking as an illustration of this, the word shroff hands up. Well, I won't be able to see everybody's hands up, but who knows what this word schroff is, right? It actually is found in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's still well used in a couple of varieties of English, but very specific ones, right? So you find it in Indian English, you find it in what is marked as Southeast Asian English, but in particular Hong Kong English, as you see in the bottom box. But in fact, you have schroff, which is really defined as a kind of banker, money lender in the East. So it's really very much associated with the East, and in particular with the Far East. And as I just mentioned, it really only exists in these varieties of English. Obviously, the Oxford English Dictionary, with their recent scope of documenting world Englishes, has updated and included this particular entry. So, what's so interesting about such a word, right? Such a cultural word, and what can this tell us about the kinds of movements of populations and the kinds of contact dynamics that have gone on before empire and beyond the usual accounts and that we know so well when we're thinking about world Englishes. And this really takes us back quite a way to the mid-13th and mid-19th century. During Persian Muslim rule in the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent, right, where there was large-scale Perso-Arabic influence. And there what you have is Arabic sharaf, money changer, which then entered Persian sharaf and Gujarati in the Indian subcontinent, right, as sharaf. And then during the long occupation of the Portuguese, as the earliest of the European explorers and settlers in this region of the world, from the mid-16th century, the word also entered Portuguese, right, as sharaf for customs officers, money changers, and then, various forms of the word schroffage and the Schroffagers Commission. Now, no time to go into it, but what we must understand, of course, is that during Portuguese Empire in Asia, Indo-Portuguese, right, various Portuguese contact languages are widespread, very dominant lingua franca between the Portuguese and the locals, and significantly, crucially, also adopted by subsequent European travelers and colonizers, the Dutch, and then the British after them, right? So, this really had a very important place in the ecology of the region, not just during that time, but, all the empires following, right? And so this word sharaf entered, was in Portuguese, and then later on entered Anglo-Indian English, sharaf, and then English schroff, okay? And then, was maintained in Indian English, and then in Hong Kong English thereafter, okay? But what's important, I think, sorry, let me just go back. What's important is really to recognize, right, these other players who may not at first glance really have anything to do with English, right, or English linguistics or the spread of English, but certainly actually have contributed to what has become world Englishes today. Another quick example, I'm just so very mindful of time, kanji, which always makes me very hungry when I start talking about it. If you Google the word kanji, you get a plethora of images of usually very Asian-based ideas of porridge, usually East Asian, right? Chinese kanji, you'll see how to make kanji Chinese recipes for East Asian kinds of dishes. And you get also kanji houses in various East Asian places. So the image on the bottom left from Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken, kanji houses everywhere and obviously you see the Chinese name as well, where you can buy these, rice porridge dishes. Image on the right is actually from Vancouver, so kanji noodle house, again, associated with the whole East Asian imaginary, right? And the whole idea of something East Asian. Again, it's an interesting thing to delve deeper into, because it's actually not only confined to the East, but found across, all the diversities that comprise Asia. So depending on local traditions, it could be rice boiled in water, but you can also use other grains or legumes, and you can use milk or coconut milk. The dish can be served plain or accompanied by other dishes and so on. So lots of formulations, and across the Asian languages, obviously you have very many other terms for this particular dish. Okay, just in Southeast Asia alone, the little box at the bottom, gives you terms like moi and jok and chow and bubur and so on, which refer to this. So why congee, right? And where does congee come from, which has now become such a part of English, right? English associated with Asia. Yes, documented in East Asia, but also in South Asia. You find the earliest reference to the dish in the Zhou dynasty, and mentioned in various sort of very classic Chinese records as the first food that's served to family members after fasting. It's associated with health benefits and nutrition, but it's also noted in India, right? And you find this in Pliny the Elder's writings in circa 77 CE. The term really comes from your South Asian languages, right? From Tamil kanji, which means boilings, water in which the rice is boiled, with all the various cognates across the various Dravidian and Indo-European, Indo-Aryan languages on the subcontinent. How did this, once again, how did the term come to be part of English? What were the contact dynamics involved to lead to this, to this outcome? And again, we find other players, right? The Portuguese, once again, in their colonies, the first Europeans in Asia encountered and adopted the dish and the word, documented in a treatise on the medicinal and economic plants of India by Garcia de Orta, and referring to this water that's squeezed out of rice. And this was disseminated through the 1600s in other European languages because of such a treatise. And then, of course, eventually entered English, documented in British travelers' accounts describing use of congee, and also translations of other European accounts which describe this particular substance. Okay, and here's an image of Garcia de Orta's treatise. If you look at the bottom left-hand side of the page, you'll see the translation. Yeah, they give the patients water to drink with pepper and cumin seed, which they call kanje, okay, which then eventually becomes congee because of its adoption into English. Okay, so two very quick examples, quick illustrations. But I hope they sort of make the point, right, that such culture words are really good indicators of language contact. They obviously get transmitted very much more easily than basic vocabulary. But what is interesting is that by delving into the roots of their transmission, we are afforded a much more nuanced kind of consideration of the contact of communities in the region. And crucially, beyond the usual groups of the English-speaking and the immediate indigenous peoples. Okay, and this really substantiates our historical understanding of cultural contact and gives us a full appreciation of the kinds of itineraries, right, quite entangled, that help to account for how the Englishes in the Asian region are what they are right now. More broadly, I think, and I turn to Tom Hoogervorst, right, who talks about more broadly about the Indian Ocean and talks about sailors, tailors, cooks, and crooks. And of course, these principles can be applied to, whatever area or region in the world that you're working on or working in, right? And I just read Hoogervorst's quote: "Loanwords in the languages encircling the Indian Ocean offer a fruitful and faintly trodden way to tie together fragments left behind by sailors and other neglected agents of the past, many of whom continue to elude scholarship. Indian Ocean historiography disproportionately features kings, merchants, conquerors, religious scholars, moneylenders, European colonial officials, and those with whom they interacted." on the margins, however, unfolded a largely parallel world aboard ships, in harbors, tailor shops, kitchens, brothels, and prisons, often leaving nothing behind except one crucial thing: language. There's been a renewed interest within Indian Ocean studies of the lives of these subalterns, yet little has been written thus far from a language-centric perspective. So I urge you all to have a look at potential subalterns in whatever areas you're working in for such intriguing views into the contact dynamics that are possible there. Now, I was going to talk about rethinking typologies, but we don't have time, and I'm skipping to part 3. Apologies for that. Where I want to think about rethink platforms, right? Platforms of communication and what that can show us. And I note my timekeeper, and I will try to get on to the end of this quite quickly. You know, I take my cue very quickly here from the idea, right, that for a variety to emerge, local practices, and we're thinking about Englishes, right, new varieties of English must gain norm value through recurring spontaneous use across various communicative functions, as well as in other emblematic domains. So the question is, when you have communities which are essentially dominant in other languages, how can such recurring spontaneous use, right, of English occur for the English to sort of evolve into its own endonormative variety? And what has been found is that computer-mediated communication can actually comprise quite a vital platform and catalyst for the evolution of English varieties. Again, as an example, we will look at Hong Kong, which, you know, might conjure up images of Kung Fu and dim sum and bilingual signs. And indeed, Hong Kong is a very interesting case in point because it's been a British colony, though anyone who's followed the news just in June will see that new Hong Kong textbooks will claim that the city was never a British colony for various political reasons, but I'll just leave that aside for now. It was returned to China in 1997 and has been operating under a one country, two systems policy, which supports biliteracy in English and Chinese written, and trilingualism, right? Cantonese, the language of the majority of the population in Hong Kong, Putonghua, because of mainland China's because of Hong Kong being a region of mainland China now, and of course English, you know, legacy of the colonial times, right? And you can see this in the landscape with English and Chinese. I know that time is passing, but I'm gonna get through this quite swiftly. Certainly, Hong Kong English has been recognized, documented quite widely in all these publications. For example, in English of the more educated, a more acrolectal version. But by and large, if you look at Hong Kong and the majority of Hong Kong speakers, or the majority of the Hong Kong population and ecology, it is hugely Cantonese dominant, right? As this, you know, image demonstrates, Chinese signs. And during the years that I was teaching at the University of Hong Kong, which is arguably the more English dominant of all the tertiary institutions, and I was in the School of English, and those are the more English speaking young people. Even while we were all operating in English, English is the, you know, working language of the territory. If we went to a break, the students would be chatting in Cantonese, right? So very much still Cantonese dominant. So, you know, how are we finding a domain where English is used much more? And this is a quick example from computer-mediated communication. And my most favorite example is this Cantonese phrase "ga yao," as you'll see on the slide, which is translated as "add oil" in English, or calqued as "add oil," which really means sort of like add fuel. Okay, work hard, persevere. Used a lot in spoken discourse, right, in Cantonese usage. So for example, and I'll just read the English gloss, you know, I argued with him a few days ago, for what, you know, just like what happened before, oh, his temper's really bad, ga yao, okay, so be strong, okay, hang in there with the bad boyfriend or whatever. So ga yao in Cantonese. This isn't spoken discourse. I used to ask my students, would you ever say the English version in spoken discourse, like add oil? They all used to laugh because they would not do that. Okay, but what they would do was, if they were using computer mediated communication, they would either Romanize, right? So this is from a WhatsApp exchange. What are you doing? Just taking some rest. I need to sleep earlier. I need to work tomorrow. Oh yeah, you're so busy. Gaya. Okay, so they would Romanize the Chinese, the Cantonese into Gayau. They would also calc it, okay, in CMC. So I have to work at 7 a.m. Oh, it's really bad. Yay, add oil. Okay, so you would find that. And then, interestingly, you started to see, over the years I was in Hong Kong, you started to see, well, you saw it in CMC, but you started to see it in spoken discourse. So very, very quickly, three tables, and we're almost done. Looking at the frequency of usage, on the left-hand block, you saw if people were speaking in spoken discourse, either in Cantonese, in mixed Cantonese and English, or in English and overall, you'd see use of Gayau much more frequently, and use of English add oil with the red bars very rarely. If they were texting, though, you see the red bars shoot up, right? So definitely, as we saw with the examples, you know, in CMC, Romanization or the English calc is much more widely used. And that already makes a beautiful point, right? That in CMC, you have a site or a platform that is quite different. And for communities which aren't English dominant, it really is a space where English is used much more often. There's more frequent mixing of codes and more stabilization of content varieties, right? And so you see lots of emergence of norms. But you also see then further evolution and a crossing back into non-CMC domains, okay? So it's back into the spoken domains. So what happened was with Hong Kong, that where you have groups of speakers who are more English dominant for various reasons. Either they're returnees, they've been away, lived and studied abroad in an English dominant place like Canada or the UK and come back to Hong Kong, or they're from mixed families, they're much more English dominant. And what you found with those respondents was that if you look at the purple and green bars, in spoken discourse, they were starting to use the English calc significantly more than, you know, local Hong Kongers, right? So it was coming back into English discourse. So that's where already the story is interesting, where if we rethink platforms and we look at CMC, we can see how that really has an impact for how new Englishes are evolving. But further that, and I will finish in a minute, other platforms such as politics and art can further catalyze the evolution of such new English varieties. So in Hong Kong, and this is very ironic because these were the pro-democracy protests against mainland China, right? And that were happening in Hong Kong in 2014. And what happened, to just cut a long story short, was during the protests where many protesters gathered in Central, some artists set up a whole system called the Add Oil Machine, where they invited overseas people to send in messages of encouragement to protesters. And the top right-hand image shows some of the messages. Okay, and they called this website the Add Oil Machine. So putting this term add oil on the global stage, and, you know, international people were all typing in things. They projected these messages on buildings in Central. So the top left-hand image just shows, you know, projections of this whole system onto the global stage, as it were, because the world's eyes were really on Hong Kong. And this continued because of such a tension during these political situations, the term adult gained more currency. Media started to pay more attention to it. And I'm going fast now. And linguists and lexicographers started to pay more attention to it. In 2016, the Oxford English Dictionary started expressing interest and looking at, you know, usage of the term add oil. And by 2018, this was added as an entry. I realize my time is running out. I will actually pretty much stop there and just show that, you know, you find add oil in various other dimensions of the landscape as well. And all in all, this is just a lesson in how going beyond, far beyond empire, and as on a different platform, you actually have opportunities for the development or the evolution of new varieties of Englishes in ways that would not normally necessarily have happened in the normal domain, right? In regular, everyday spoken interaction. And just to end, just to sum up, rethinking the contact dynamics scenarios before and beyond empire really brings us to much more nuanced engagement with different players beyond different processes in the evolution of Englishes, and really is very instructive for general patterns of contact, evolution, and English linguistics research for more broader and more unified theorizing in the discipline. Apologies for going over, and thank you very much for your attention. Let me get out of this for now and stop share. Sorry, those were other screens. Thank you very much.
I think we might have time for one tiny quick question. Does anyone have a super quick question? Is there one from
a few quick Q&A questions.
Yes, that's it.
From Viola Copolati. They ask you whether you could identify examples of computer media communication, the examples you use in your study of the CMC, and whether you'd be able to refer them to other studies they can read that feature the insertion of native words in English dominated contexts, especially sociolinguistic studies.
All right, thank you very much for the question. So do you mean, I'm looking at the chat as well, examples of computer CMC that I used in my study? So several of them were from a small study that I had conducted. So many of the examples were from that small corpus, and they are actually, I don't know what you mean. Do you want to see more of them? So there are some in the readings that have been mentioned, and there was another study that I referred to as well, which was a master's MPhil, I think, that was done by a Hong Konger, which looked at that, but I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking. And other studies that feature the insertion of native words in English dominated contexts. Gosh, okay, I don't even know where to start. If we start to look at any work which in world Englishes scholarship, there, by definition, I think when you look at world Englishes, it's not so much just an insertion of native words in English dominated context, but really the evolution of contact variety, English varieties, which demonstrate either mixing or restructuring of the grammar, or restructuring of the pronunciation, which shows influence from the local languages. So I think the entire realm of world English scholarship, all studies there, will be able to give lots of examples of more broadly, I mean, more than just insertion of native words. I hope that helps to identify, to answer that question. Anything else that anybody, or perhaps we're at the end of time?
We are unfortunately out of time, but would it be okay if people email you their questions if they would like?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, I'm so sorry not to be there in person. Everyone you're most welcome to get in touch with me by email with any questions, and I can obviously answer you much more comprehensively and give you suggestions and readings and so on the directions that you might be interested in.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Lim. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to have been a part of this, even for a short moment. All the very best, and enjoy the rest of your summer school.
Thank you.